The crystal chandeliers of the royal palace cast fractured light across marble floors, polished to mirror perfection. And in those reflections, Cassian saw himself as the court saw him, a shadow meant to serve and never be seen. His hands trembled slightly as he balanced the silver tray laden with crystal goblets filled with blood wine, the traditional drink of alpha nobility during ceremonial gatherings. The great hall buzzed with conversation, laughter that rang too loud and confident, the sound of people who had never questioned their place in the world. Cassian moved through them like water, fluid and unnoticed, years of practice making him nearly invisible despite the omega scent that marked him as lesser in their eyes. He had learned to make himself small, to breathe shallowly so his presence wouldn't offend, to keep his violet eyes downcast because meeting an alpha's gaze was considered an act of defiance, punishable by public humiliation, or worse. Lord Damien Blackthorne stood near. The eastern windows, his powerful frame draped in midnight blue velvet, embroidered with silver wolves, the sigil of his ancient house. His dark hair was swept back from a face that might have been handsome, if not for the cruelty that twisted his features whenever he smiled. Beside him, Lady Seraphina Ashford preened in crimson silk that clung to her curves, her blonde hair elaborately styled with rubies woven through each twist and curl. They were the epitome of alpha perfection by the kingdom's standards, strong, beautiful, influential, and absolutely convinced of their superiority over every other designation. Cassian had served them countless times over the past 3 years, and each encounter had been a small death, a reminder that he existed only to be used and discarded. If you're enjoying this story of justice and transformation, please like this video, and let me know in the comments what you think about Cassian's journey so far. Tonight was the coronation feast for King Theron, the young alpha who had ascended to the throne just 3 days prior after his father's sudden death from heart failure. The late king had been a tyrant who reinforced every oppressive law that kept Omegas subjugated, but whispers suggested his son might be different. Cassian tried not to hope, because hope was dangerous for someone like him. It made the inevitable disappointments cut deeper. He approached Lord Damien's group with his tray, preparing to refill their goblets as protocol demanded. But before he could complete the simple task, Damien's hand shot out and gripped his wrist with bruising force. The alpha's eyes glittered with malicious amusement as he examined Cassian like one might inspect a particularly interesting insect. Seraphina laughed, that tinkling sound that always preceded something terrible, and moved closer until Cassian could smell her expensive perfume mixed with the aggressive alpha pheromones she released deliberately to make him uncomfortable. Damien's voice carried across the immediate area, drawing attention from nearby nobles who turned with interest, scenting entertainment. Look at this pathetic creature, so careful with our drinks as if he's handling something precious, instead of serving his betters as nature intended. Tell me, Omega, do you ever wonder what it's like to be important? To matter in any real way? Or have you accepted that your entire existence is meant to be in service to those of us with actual value? His fingers tightened on Cassian's wrist until bones ground together. But Cassian had learned long ago not to show pain, because that only encouraged them. He kept his expression neutral, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and waited for it to be over like he always did. Seraphina circled him slowly, her heels clicking against marble, and when she spoke, her voice dripped with false sweetness. Perhaps we should test his usefulness. See if he can perform tricks for our amusement. What do you say, Damien? Should we make him dance? Or perhaps crawl across the floor on his hands and knees while the court watches? I'm sure our new king would appreciate the entertainment. The crowd that had gathered around them laughed, some uncomfortably, but most with genuine amusement, because this was normal in their world. Omegas existed to be humiliated and reminded of their place. Cassian felt the familiar numbness spreading through his chest, the protective dissociation that allowed him to survive moments like these without breaking completely. He had endured worse than words, had survived beatings and violations that left scars both visible and hidden, and he would survive this too because survival was all he had left. But then Damien did something he had never done before. He took the goblet from Cassian's tray and slowly, deliberately, poured the blood wine over Cassian's head. The liquid was cold and sticky, soaking through his simple servant's tunic, and dripping down his face in rivulets that stained his skin. Purple red. The crowd gasped and then erupted in laughter. Some nobles literally clutching their sides, as if this was the funniest thing they had witnessed in years. Serafina clapped her hands in delight and grabbed another goblet, adding her contribution to Cassian's humiliation, until he stood drenched and trembling, the wine pooling at his feet. "Kneel," Damien commanded, his voice hard as iron and expecting instant obedience. "Show everyone here what an Omega is truly worth. Show them the natural order that our new king would be wise to maintain." Cassian's legs moved before his mind fully processed the command, years of conditioning making resistance almost impossible, and he sank to his knees in the spreading puddle of wine, his hands clenched into fists against his thighs, nails biting into palms hard enough to draw blood, the only rebellion he could safely express. The laughter continued, echoing off vaulted ceilings adorned with frescoes depicting great alpha warriors, conquering their enemies. And Cassian wondered distantly if this was how his story would end, not in some dramatic fashion, but in this slow, grinding erasure of dignity, until nothing remained but an empty shell going through motions. The laughter died suddenly, cut off as if someone had severed its source, and the silence that replaced it was somehow more terrible. Cassian kept his eyes fixed on the wine-stained marble, not daring to look up, assuming another torment was coming. But then he heard footsteps, measured and purposeful, accompanied by the rustle of expensive fabric and the distinctive scent of a powerful alpha that made every instinct in his body come alive with awareness. A shadow fell across him, blocking the chandelier light, and a voice spoke that Cassian had only heard from a distance during ceremonial proceedings. "Rise." The command was simple, one word, but it carried absolute authority that made even Damien take an involuntary step backward. Cassian's body responded. Before his mind caught up, years of obedience to alpha commands overriding his shock, and he found himself standing on shaking legs, finally raising his eyes to meet the gaze of King Theron himself. The young king was 26, tall and broad-shouldered with dark auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, and eyes the color of molten gold that seemed to see straight through to Cassian's battered soul. His face was striking, rather than conventionally handsome, all strong angles, and a jaw that suggested he could be as hard as his father had been, but there was something different in his expression, a carefully controlled fury that burned cold rather than hot. Theron wore the formal regalia of his office, midnight black leather and silk embroidered with golden thread depicting the royal crest, and the crown of twisted silver and moonstone sat on his head like it had been made specifically for him. He looked at Cassian for a long moment, taking in the wine-soaked clothing, the trembling hands, the carefully blank expression that didn't quite hide the pain underneath, and something flickered in those golden eyes that Cassian couldn't name. Then Theron turned his attention to Lord Damien and Lady Serafina, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Explain yourselves," the king said quietly, his voice conversational but edged with something dangerous. "Explain to me why I just witnessed 2 members of my nobility publicly humiliating a servant during my coronation feast. Explain why you thought this was appropriate behavior in my court, in my presence, on a night meant to celebrate unity and the beginning of a new era for our kingdom." Damien recovered quickly, his natural arrogance reasserting itself, and he offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your Majesty, we were simply reminding this Omega of his proper place, maintaining the social order that has kept our kingdom strong for centuries. Surely you understand the importance of hierarchy, of ensuring that each designation knows and accepts their role. My father spoke highly of your house, praised your family's dedication to traditional values." Theron's expression didn't change, but something about his stillness became predatory. "Traditional values," he repeated, tasting the words like they were poison. "Is that what you call this tradition? I call it cruelty. Unnecessary and cowardly cruelty, inflicted on someone who cannot defend himself without facing. Severe punishment. I call it the behavior of weak individuals who derive pleasure from exerting power over those they perceive as helpless. Tell me, Lord Damien, do you feel strong now? Do you feel powerful having poured wine over a servant's head while your peers laughed? Serafina stepped forward, attempting to smooth over the situation with practiced diplomacy. Your Majesty, perhaps we were overzealous in our demonstration, but surely you cannot fault us for upholding the distinctions that keep chaos at bay. Without clear hierarchies, without reminders of natural order, society crumbles into anarchy. We were taught these principles by your own father. The mention of the late king made Theron's jaw tighten, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. My father taught many things, he said, his voice still dangerously quiet. He taught that might makes right, that power justifies any action, that those born into privilege deserve it simply by virtue of blood. He taught that omegas were property to be used and discarded, that their pain was inconsequential, that their lives held no inherent value beyond service. My father was wrong. The statement hung in the air like a thunderclap, nobles gasping and whispering furiously because openly contradicting the late king's philosophy was tantamount to heresy. Theron ignored them, his attention fixed on the two nobles before him. Lord Damien Blackthorne, Lady Serafina Ashford, I hereby strip you of all titles, lands, privileges, and positions within this court effective immediately. You are no longer nobles of this realm. You are simply citizens, and as such you will learn what it means to exist without the protection of status and wealth. The great hall erupted into chaos, nobles shouting in protest and confusion, some demanding explanation, while others argued that the king couldn't possibly be serious. Damien's face went white, then flushed dark red with rage. You cannot do this, he sputtered, his composure completely shattered. My family has served the crown for 8 generations. Our lands, our titles, they are ours by right of blood and heritage. You have no authority to simply take them away because of some misplaced sympathy for a worthless omega. Theron's smile was sharp as a blade. I am king, he said simply. I have every authority, and I'm using it now. Your lands, your titles, your position, all of it is forfeit. Security will escort you from the palace within the hour, and you will not return unless I personally summon you, which I doubt will happen in your lifetime. As for your family's legacy, perhaps future generations will learn from your failure and understand that cruelty is not a virtue to be cultivated. Serafina's carefully maintained composure cracked, tears of fury and humiliation streaming down her face. This is insane, she hissed. You're destroying centuries of tradition, undermining the very foundations of our society over one insignificant omega who should be grateful to even breathe the same air as his betters. You'll regret this, Theron. You'll see that without strong alphas maintaining order, everything will collapse. Theron turned away from her dismissively. Take them out of my sight, he ordered the guards who had materialized at his gesture. Make sure they understand that any attempt to reclaim their former status through force or manipulation will result in permanent exile or worse. The guards moved efficiently, gripping Damien and Serafina by their arms and beginning to drag them toward the exits despite their protests and struggles. The crowd parted to let them pass, nobles staring in shock and whispering frantically, clearly uncertain whether to support their king's radical decision or condemn it as the action of a tyrant, worse than his father. When the former nobles had been removed, their shouted threats fading into the distance, Theron turned back to Cassian, who still stood frozen in place, unable to process what had just happened. The king reached out slowly, giving Cassian time to flinch away if he wanted, and when he didn't move, Theron gently touched his shoulder. Come with me, he said quietly, his voice pitched for Cassian's ears alone. We need to talk, and you need to get cleaned up. This isn't a punishment, he added quickly, seeing fear flash across Cassian's face. This is an offer, one you're free to refuse, but I hope you'll accept. Cassian found his voice finally, rough from disuse and emotion. Why? He asked, the single word encompassing everything he couldn't articulate. Why would you do that for me? Why would you throw away political alliances and anger your entire court over someone like me? Theron's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained intense. Because someone like you deserves better than to be treated as less than human. Because I watched you take their abuse without crying, without begging, and I saw strength that most of these so-called powerful alphas will never possess. And because the moment I looked into your eyes, I knew that nothing in my life would ever be the same. Subscribe to the channel to see how Cassian's impossible journey from servant to noble transforms not just his life, but the entire kingdom's future. The private chambers Theron led him to were more luxurious than anywhere Cassian had ever been allowed to enter, with walls covered in tapestries depicting pastoral scenes, furniture carved from dark wood and upholstered in deep blue velvet, and windows that overlooked the palace gardens where moonlight painted everything silver. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, warming the space and casting dancing shadows that made the room feel intimate despite its size. Theron gestured to a side door. There's a bathing room through there, with everything you'll need. Take your time, clean up, and there are fresh clothes on the shelf that should fit reasonably well. I'll wait here, and when you're ready, we can discuss what happens next. His tone was gentle, completely different from the cold authority he had displayed in the Great Hall. And Cassian felt something in his chest crack slightly, a fissure in the protective walls he had built around his heart. The bathing room was extravagant, with a large copper tub already filled with steaming water that smelled faintly of lavender and something else he couldn't identify. Some herb that relaxed his tense muscles just from breathing it. Cassian stripped off his wine-soaked clothing, wincing at the bruises already forming on his wrist where Damien had gripped him, and sank into the water with a sigh that came from somewhere deep in his soul. He couldn't remember the last time he had bathed in hot water. Servant quarters had only cold pumps, and the luxury of it made his eyes burn with unshed tears. He scrubbed his skin until it was pink and clean, washing the wine from his hair and trying to wash away the memory of standing in that puddle while nobles laughed at his humiliation. But no amount of soap could erase the scars on his psyche, the accumulated damage of years spent being told he was worthless. And Cassian wondered what game the king was playing, what he could possibly want from someone like him. When he emerged wearing the simple but well-made clothing Theron had provided, soft cotton pants and a tunic in deep green that actually fit his slender frame, he found the king sitting by the fire with 2 glasses of wine on the small table beside him. Theron looked up and something in his expression shifted, became almost vulnerable before he masked it with a slight smile. "Better," he said. "Please, sit. You're not in trouble, and you're not here to serve me. You're here because I owe you an explanation, and because I need to make you an offer that you'll probably think I'm insane for making." Cassian sat carefully on the edge of the chair opposite Theron, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that Omegas didn't sit in the presence of alphas, especially not kings. But Theron's expectant gaze kept him in place. The king leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and studied Cassian with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. "I grew up watching my father destroy people," Theron began, his voice low and rough with emotion. "He was a tyrant who believed that power justified any action, any cruelty, any abuse. He taught me that weakness was contemptible, that mercy was for fools, that Omegas existed only to serve and suffer. For years I believed him because he was my father, my king, and questioning him was unthinkable. But as I got older, as I watched him break people for his own amusement, I started to see the truth. Strength isn't about dominating others. It's about having the power to do harm and choosing not to. Real leadership isn't about crushing those beneath you. It's about lifting them up until hierarchy becomes irrelevant. My father died hating me because in his last years I started opposing his cruelty. And I've spent every moment since his death planning how to dismantle everything he built." Cassian listened, afraid to speak and break whatever spell had made the king share such personal information. Theron continued, his golden eyes reflecting firelight. "When I saw Damien and Seraphina humiliating you tonight, I saw every injustice my father perpetrated, every Omega he hurt, every servant he brutalized. I saw the system that keeps people like you trapped in suffering, while people like them profit from that suffering. And I decided that my reign would begin with a statement. with action that showed I meant every word when I said things were going to change. But here's the part where you'll think I've lost my mind. Theron reached into his jacket and pulled out an ornate scroll sealed with the royal crest. This document transfers all of Damien's titles, lands, and holdings to you. You are now Lord Cassian of House Blackthorn, with all the rights, privileges, and protections that title confers. You own estates that generate substantial income. You have a seat on the noble council, and you answer to no one but me. The words didn't make sense, couldn't possibly be real, and Cassian found himself shaking his head slowly. That's impossible, he whispered. I'm an Omega, a servant. I don't even have a family name, let alone the education or background to manage noble holdings. You can't just make me a lord. The court will never accept it. They'll tear me apart the moment you're not there to protect me. Theron's smile was grim. They'll try, he agreed. They'll scheme and plot and do everything in their considerable power to undermine you. That's why I'm not just giving you titles and walking away. I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about politics, about managing estates, about navigating court intrigue. I'm going to give you the best tutors in the kingdom, guards loyal to me personally, and resources to build your own power base. This isn't charity, Cassian. This is investment. I believe you have the strength and intelligence to not just survive in that world, but to thrive and help me change it. Cassian's mind reeled, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered. But why me? He asked again, desperate to understand. There must be dozens of Omegas in this kingdom who are smarter, more educated, better prepared for this kind of responsibility. Why choose someone with no experience, no connections, no leverage? Theron was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Because when I looked at you tonight, when our eyes met, I felt something I've never felt before, he said finally. A connection, a pull, something that told me you were important in ways I don't fully understand yet. I don't believe in destiny or fate, but I believe in instinct. And every instinct I have is screaming that you and I are meant to do something significant together. He paused, then added more quietly, and because I saw the way you didn't. Break. Even when they tried their hardest to break you. That kind of resilience is rare, and it's exactly what I need in an ally. The word ally hung between them, carrying implications that made Cassian's heart race. He looked down at his hands, at the fading bruises on his wrist, and tried to imagine those same hands signing documents and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. It seemed absurd, impossible, like a fever dream that would dissolve when he woke up in his narrow servant's bed. But Theron was watching him with such earnest intensity, such genuine hope, that Cassian found himself considering the offer, seriously, despite every logical reason to refuse. If I accept, he said slowly, if I somehow manage to learn everything I need to know and survive the inevitable attacks from every noble in the kingdom, what do you get out of this? What's the real reason you're risking so much political capital on someone like me? Theron leaned back, his expression thoughtful. I get an ally who understands suffering, who knows what it's like to be at the mercy of the powerful, and who will therefore fight to change the systems that create that suffering. I get someone who owes their position to merit and my trust, rather than inherited privilege, which means they'll be loyal to the vision of what this kingdom could be, rather than clinging to what it's always been. And selfishly, he added with a slight smile, I get someone interesting to talk to. Someone who won't just tell me what I want to hear because they're afraid or angling for advantage. You don't know how rare that is in a court full of sycophants and manipulators. Cassian felt something shift inside him, a tiny spark of possibility igniting, despite his attempts to smother it with realism. If I do this, if I accept your offer, I need you to promise me something, he said, his voice gaining strength. Promise me that if I fail, if I prove inadequate or make mistakes that harm people, you'll remove me from that position immediately. I won't let innocent people suffer because of my incompetence or because you were too stubborn to admit you made a bad choice. Theron's eyes widened slightly. Then he smiled, with what looked like genuine pleasure. That's exactly the kind of thing I needed to hear, he said. Yes, I promise. If you prove truly inadequate, which I don't believe will happen, I'll find you another position where you can be useful and happy without endangering others. But I don't think that's going to be necessary, Cassian. I think you're going to surprise everyone, including yourself, with what you're capable of achieving. Now, do we have an agreement? Are you willing to take this leap of faith with me and see where it leads? Cassian took a deep breath, feeling like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump into unknown waters. Every rational part of his mind screamed that this was insane, that he should refuse politely and return to the safety of obscurity. But another part, the part that had endured years of abuse and humiliation without breaking, the part that had dreamed impossible dreams in the darkness of his servants' quarters, that part whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to become something more than a victim. He met Theron's golden eyes and found himself nodding. Yes, he said, the word coming out stronger than he expected. Yes, I'll do it. I'll accept your offer and try to become whatever you need me to be, even though I'm terrified and certain this is going to end in disaster. Theron's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face and making him look younger and less burdened. Then we start tomorrow, he said. Tonight, you rest in chambers I've had prepared for you in the noble wing. Tomorrow we begin your education and introduce you formally to the court as Lord Cassian. It's going to be hard, probably the hardest thing you've ever done, but I'll be with you every step of the way. You're not alone in this anymore. Those words, simple as they were, hit Cassian with unexpected force, and he felt his eyes burning with tears he refused to shed. He had been alone for so long, isolated even when surrounded by other servants, that the promise of partnership, of someone standing with him rather than over him, was almost too much to process. If you want to see how this impossible alliance transforms into something that shakes the foundations of an entire kingdom, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. The next morning began earlier than Cassian would have liked, with a polite knock on his door, followed by the entrance of 3 servants carrying breakfast and clothing far more elaborate than anything he had worn in his life. The chambers Theron had given him were stunning, with a large bed draped in silk, windows that overlooked the gardens, and furniture that probably cost more than Cassian would have earned in a decade of service. He ate the breakfast, mechanically, too nervous to taste the food, and allowed the servants to help him into clothing that marked him as nobility. A tailored jacket in deep blue with silver embroidery, matching pants, and boots of soft leather that fit perfectly. They styled his dark hair carefully, and even applied subtle cosmetics to hide the shadows under his eyes, transforming him from the bedraggled servant of last night into someone who looked like they might actually belong among the elite. When he looked at himself in the full-length mirror, Cassian barely recognized the person staring back. Theron arrived precisely at the 8th hour, accompanied by an older Omega named Marcus, who carried an armful of books and scrolls. The king looked Cassian over approvingly. "Perfect," he said. "You look like someone the court will have to take seriously, at least visually. Now comes the hard part, actually earning that respect. Marcus will be your primary tutor. He's been managing noble estates for 40 years, and knows more about finance, agriculture, and law than anyone else in the kingdom. He's also an Omega, which means he understands the unique challenges you'll face and can teach you how to navigate them." Marcus bowed slightly, his weathered face showing neither judgment nor pity, just calm professionalism. "It's an honor to work with you, Lord Cassian," he said, and Cassian nearly flinched at the title. "We have a lot of ground to cover, but I've taught nobles who started with far less natural intelligence than you clearly possess. You'll do fine." The days that followed blurred together into an exhausting routine of lessons, meetings, and carefully orchestrated public appearances, designed to establish Cassian's legitimacy as a member of the nobility. Marcus proved to be an excellent teacher, patient but demanding, willing to explain concepts multiple times, but expecting Cassian to work hard and retain information. They covered estate management, crop rotation, taxation, trade, agreements, and the intricate web of alliances and feuds that defined noble politics. Cassian learned which families could be trusted, which were openly hostile, and which were waiting to see which way the wind blew before committing to any faction. He studied legal codes that governed everything from property rights to marriage contracts, discovering that many laws were specifically designed to disadvantage Omegas and maintain alpha supremacy. When he pointed this out to Marcus, the older Omega smiled grimly. "Now you understand what needs to change," he said. "Knowledge is the first step toward reform." Theron joined their sessions whenever his royal duties allowed, sometimes sitting in to observe Cassian's progress and sometimes taking over the lessons himself to teach aspects of leadership that couldn't be found in books. He spoke about the art of negotiation, how to read people's true intentions behind polite words, how to build coalitions among disparate groups with conflicting interests. He shared stories from his own education, including the harsh lessons his father had taught through intimidation and violence, and explained how he had learned to lead differently by observing what not to do. During these conversations, Cassian began to see past the crown and royal authority to the complicated person underneath, someone carrying tremendous weight and trying desperately to use power responsibly while surrounded by people who wanted him to abuse it. There was a loneliness in Theron that mirrored Cassian's own, and gradually they began to build something that felt almost like friendship, despite the vast differences in their circumstances. The court's reaction to Cassian's elevation was exactly as hostile as expected. The first time Theron brought him to a council meeting, introducing him formally as Lord Cassian of House Blackthorn with full voting rights on noble affairs, the room erupted in protest. Older nobles shouted about tradition and proper procedure, demanding to know by what right an Omega could sit among them as an equal. Younger nobles, perhaps more calculating, remained silent, but their expressions conveyed clear contempt. Theron let them vent their outrage for several minutes before standing and waiting for silence. When he had everyone's attention, his voice was cold as winter. "Lord Cassian holds his title by the same right that any of you hold yours, by my decree as your king. If any of you wish to challenge that decree, you're welcome to take your complaints to the formal petition process, though I warn you that questioning my authority will not end well for you. Now, we have actual business to discuss, so either accept the reality of our new council member or leave this chamber and forfeit your voice in kingdom affairs." No one left, but the tension remained thick enough to cut. Cassian sat through that first meeting, trying to make himself invisible, old habits dying hard, but Theron repeatedly drew him into discussions and asked his opinion on various matters. At first, Cassian demurred, claiming insufficient knowledge, but when Theron pressed him to speak honestly, he found himself offering perspectives that clearly hadn't occurred to the alpha-dominated council. When they discussed a proposed tax increase to fund road repairs, Cassian pointed out that the burden would fall disproportionately on farmers who were already struggling with poor harvests, and suggested alternative funding sources that wouldn't devastate the rural economy. His suggestions were practical and showed genuine concern for people the council normally ignored, and while most nobles dismissed his input, a few looked thoughtful. After the meeting, a beta named Lord Ferris approached Cassian in the corridor. "That was interesting analysis regarding the taxation proposal," he said carefully. "Where did you learn economic theory?" Cassian chose honesty over pretense. "I didn't learn it formally," he admitted. "But I grew up in poverty, and I've seen how policies that sound reasonable to wealthy people can destroy poor communities. Sometimes lived experience is as valuable as academic study." Ferris studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps you're right," he said. "I'll consider your alternative suggestions more seriously. Don't expect everyone to come around so easily, but you've at least proven you're not completely ignorant." It wasn't much, barely even acceptance, but it was a start, and Cassian clung to that small victory as evidence that maybe, possibly, he could actually do this. Meanwhile, Damien and Seraphina were not taking their fall from grace quietly. Stripped of titles and wealth, facing social ostracism from people who had once courted their favor, they became increasingly desperate and dangerous. Cassian began receiving threatening letters, anonymous messages promising revenge, and detailing various creative ways they planned to make him suffer. The palace guard intercepted several, packages containing dead animals and cryptic warnings. Theron ordered increased security around Cassian, assigning him personal guards who accompanied him everywhere. But the constant vigilance was exhausting and reminded Cassian that his new position made him a target. He mentioned the threats to Marcus during one of their lessons, trying to sound casual about it. But the older Omega saw through him immediately. "Fear is reasonable," Marcus said gently. "You'd be a fool not to be afraid of people who have nothing left to lose. But don't let that fear paralyze you. The best revenge against people like Damien and Seraphina is to succeed so thoroughly that they become irrelevant." 3 months into his new role, Cassian received an invitation that made his blood run cold. Lady Seraphina, no longer technically a lady but still using the title out of habit or defiance, requested a private meeting to discuss reconciliation. The message was written in elegant script and used polite language, but something about it felt wrong to Cassian's increasingly sharp political instincts. He showed the letter to Theron, who read it with a frown. "It's a trap," the king said immediately. "She's not interested in reconciliation. She wants to hurt you in some way that can't be easily traced back to her. Decline the meeting." But Cassian found himself hesitating, an idea forming in his mind. "What if I accept?" he said slowly. "But on my terms, in a public space with guards present and witnesses to everything. That said, if she truly wants to reconcile, she'll agree to those conditions. If she refuses or tries to change the location, that tells us her intentions were malicious, and we can use that information against her." Theron looked surprised, then impressed. "That's good strategic thinking," he admitted. "All right, if you're certain you want to do this, arrange the meeting in the palace gardens during the afternoon when there will be plenty of people around. Take at least 4 guards and make sure Marcus is nearby in case you need support. And Cassian," he added, his voice softening, "don't let her manipulate you emotionally. She'll try to make you feel guilty or uncertain. That's what people like her do best. Remember that you've earned your position through hard work and deserve respect." Cassian nodded, touched by Theron's concern, but also aware that he needed to face his former tormentors eventually. Running away wouldn't change anything, and part of establishing himself as someone to be taken seriously meant confronting threats directly rather than hiding behind the king's protection. The meeting took place on a clear autumn afternoon, with golden sunlight filtering through trees that were just beginning to turn red and orange. Cassian arrived first, choosing a table near the fountain where his guards could maintain visibility while giving the illusion of privacy. Seraphina appeared fashionably late, wearing a simple dress that was still clearly expensive, and carrying herself with the same arrogance she had displayed when she had titles and wealth. But Cassian noticed details that betrayed her changed circumstances. The dress was last season's style, her jewelry was modest compared to her previous extravagance, and there were shadows under her eyes that cosmetics couldn't quite hide. She sat down across from him without asking permission, her smile sharp and humorless. "Well, well, the Omega who thought he could play at being noble," she said by way of greeting. "Tell me, Lord Cassian," and she made his title sound like an insult. "Are you enjoying your stolen life, sleeping in beds that belong to others and pretending you have the right to make decisions about kingdom affairs?" Cassian had prepared for this, rehearsing responses with Marcus and Theron until he felt reasonably confident he wouldn't be rattled. "Nothing was stolen," he said calmly. "King Theron redistributed assets that you lost through your own actions. You humiliated me publicly, displayed cruelty that violated the king's standards for noble conduct, and paid the price for that choice. If you came here hoping I would apologize for your consequences or voluntarily give up my position out of guilt, you're wasting both our time." Seraphina's eyes flashed with fury. "You arrogant little Omega," she hissed, leaning forward. "You think one powerful alpha protecting you makes you safe, makes you legitimate? Theron will lose interest eventually, move on to whatever new cause catches his fancy, and when that happens, every noble you've offended will tear you apart. You're living on borrowed time, and when it runs out, I'm going to enjoy watching you fall even further than you've risen." Instead of fear, Cassian felt something unexpected, a cold anger that burned steady and fierce. "Let me tell you what I think, Lady Seraphina," he said, deliberately using her former title mockingly. "I think you're terrified. I think you lay awake at night knowing that your entire identity was built on inherited privilege that you never earned and never deserved. I think watching an Omega rise to where you fell has shaken everything you believed about natural order and hierarchy, and you can't stand the cognitive dissonance. You want me to fail not because I've done anything to harm you, but because my success proves that everything you were taught about alphas being inherently superior was a lie. Your power wasn't real strength. It was borrowed authority propped up by unjust systems. And now that it's gone, you have nothing left. That's what truly terrifies you. The realization that you were never as special as you thought you were." Seraphina's face went white, then red, her hands clenching into fists. "You're going to regret those words," she whispered. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you really are. A pretender. A fraud. Someone who spread their legs for the king and got rewarded with titles they'll never be capable of managing. I'm going to destroy your reputation so thoroughly that you'll wish you had stayed a servant." Cassian stood, indicating the meeting was over. "You can certainly try," he said, "but reputation is built on actions, and I intend to prove my worth through consistent service to the kingdom and its people. Meanwhile, you're building a reputation for bitterness and petty revenge, and I suspect most reasonable people will judge which of us is behaving nobly. Good day, Seraphina." He walked away without looking back, hearing her shouted threats fade behind him. And despite the trembling in his hands, he felt strangely victorious. He had faced his tormentor and held his ground, had spoken truth to someone who had once made him kneel and whine, and that felt like progress. Theron was waiting in Cassian's chambers when he returned, pacing nervously until Cassian entered. "How did it go?" the king asked immediately. "Are you all right? Did she threaten you? Should I have her arrested?" Cassian couldn't help smiling at the barrage of questions, touched by Theron's concern. "I'm fine," he said. "She threatened my reputation and implied I'm only here because of sexual favors, but nothing actionable. Mostly she just confirmed that she's desperate and angry, which means she's likely to make mistakes we can exploit. I handled it better than I expected, actually." Theron's relief was visible, tension draining from his shoulders. "Good," he said. "That's good. I'm proud of you. Not every nobleman twice your age would have handled that confrontation." As well, he hesitated, then added more quietly, "About what she implied, I want you to know that I never expected anything from you beyond political alliance and friendship. If people choose to believe we're involved romantically or sexually, that's their prejudice speaking. But I won't let those rumors harm your reputation if I can prevent it." Cassian appreciated the clarification, even as he noticed something complicated in Theron's expression when he mentioned romance. The truth was that over the past months, Cassian had developed feelings for the king that went far beyond gratitude or political expediency. He admired Theron's dedication to justice, his willingness to challenge systems that benefited him personally in order to create a better kingdom, his gentleness in private that contrasted with the authority he displayed in public. And there were moments, brief flashes when their eyes met, or when Theron touched his shoulder in passing, where Cassian sensed something reciprocal, a connection that went deeper than either of them had acknowledged aloud. But the power imbalance was real and concerning. Cassian owed his entire position to Theron's goodwill, and any romantic relationship would be complicated by questions of coercion and genuine consent. So Cassian pushed those feelings down, focusing instead on proving himself worthy of the trust Theron had placed in him. The kingdom's response to Cassian's presence in the nobility remained mixed, but gradually shifted toward grudging acceptance as months turned into a year. His management of the Blackthorn estates proved surprisingly effective. He implemented farming techniques suggested by the farmers themselves, rather than imposing plans from above, invested in infrastructure improvements that increased productivity, and treated workers with respect that earned their loyalty. When harvests came in, above projections, and estate income increased, while worker satisfaction also rose, even skeptical nobles had to acknowledge competence. Cassian's voting record on the council consistently favored policies that benefited common people rather than protecting elite privilege, which made him unpopular with traditional nobles, but gradually earned support from more progressive factions and from the populace who heard about his advocacy through various channels. Theron began implementing broader reforms, using Cassian's success as evidence that merit should matter more than birth. He proposed new laws limiting the punishments alphas could inflict on omegas, establishing educational programs for all designations regardless of class, and creating pathways for upward mobility based on demonstrated ability. Each reform faced fierce resistance from nobles who benefited from the existing system, but Theron proved willing to use his authority ruthlessly when necessary, threatening to strip titles and redistribute wealth to anyone who actively sabotaged his initiatives. Cassian found himself at the center of these reform efforts, his perspective as someone who had experienced oppression firsthand, making him invaluable in crafting policies that actually addressed problems rather than just sounding good rhetorically. He worked closely with Theron, often late into the night, debating approaches and refining proposals until they were as effective as possible. During one of these late-night working sessions, approximately 18 months after Cassian's elevation, Theron set down the document they had been reviewing and looked at Cassian with unusual intensity. "I need to tell you something," the king said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "Something I've been trying to ignore but can't anymore." Cassian's heart rate picked up, sensing that whatever was coming would be significant. Theron took a deep breath. "From the first moment I saw you, standing in that puddle of wine with your head held high despite everything they did to break you, I felt a connection I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just sympathy, just recognition of injustice and admiration for your strength. But over these months working together, getting to know you as a person rather than a cause to champion, I've realized the truth. You're my mate, Cassian. We're bonded, connected in ways that go beyond choice or logic. I can feel you in ways I can't describe. Your emotions, your presence, like you're part of my soul. And I hope, that you feel it too." The words hung in the air between them, and Cassian found himself unable to breathe properly. He had suspected, had felt the pull between them growing stronger with each interaction, but hearing Theron say it aloud made it real in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Yes," Cassian whispered. "Yes, I feel it too. I've felt it almost from the beginning, but I didn't know if it was real or if I was just projecting because you saved me, gave me a life I never thought possible. And I was afraid to say anything because of the power. Difference, because I owe you everything, and I didn't want you to think I was trying to manipulate you, or that I felt obligated to return your feelings." Theron moved closer, his hand reaching out to cup Cassian's face with gentleness that made Cassian's eyes burn. "You don't owe me anything," he said firmly. "Everything you've achieved, you've earned through your own intelligence and hard work. I gave you opportunity, but you're the one who seized it and made something of it. And as for power, imbalances, you're a noble now with your own wealth and authority. You could refuse me and maintain your position. I would never retaliate or punish you for not returning my feelings. This needs to be your choice, freely made, or it means nothing." Cassian leaned into the touch, letting himself feel the rightness of Theron's hand against his skin. "It's not a choice," he said softly. "It's recognition of something that already exists between us, something that feels inevitable. I'm terrified of what this means politically, of how people will react and what they'll say, but I can't deny what I feel anymore. You're my mate too, Theron, and I think maybe I've been falling in love with you since that first night when you offered me dignity instead of pity." Theron's smile was brilliant, transforming his usually serious face into something radiant. "Then we'll face the political consequences together," he said. "We'll deal with the gossip and the condemnation and the inevitable accusations that I elevated you just to claim you as my mate. We'll prove them wrong through our actions, through the kingdom we build together, and through the genuine partnership we forge. But right now, just for tonight, can we forget about politics and duty, and just be two people who found each other against impossible odds? Cassian answered by closing the distance between them and pressing his lips to Theron's in a kiss that felt like coming home after years of wandering lost. The king responded immediately, pulling Cassian close and deepening the kiss with a passion that made Cassian's knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Theron rested his forehead against Cassian's. "I've wanted to do that for so long," he confessed. "Every time I watched you stand up to nobles who looked down on you, every time you argued passionately for policies that would help people others ignored, every time you smiled at some small victory, I wanted to kiss you and tell you how extraordinary you are." Cassian laughed, the sound slightly shaky. "I spent months trying to convince myself that what I felt was just gratitude or hero worship, anything except genuine attraction to someone so far above my original station. But you never treated me like I was beneath you. Even before you gave me titles, you saw me as a person when everyone else saw an object. And that meant everything." They spent that night together, not rushing into physical intimacy, but simply holding each other and talking about everything they had held back, fears and hopes and dreams, for what their partnership could accomplish. Theron spoke about the loneliness of kingship, how everyone wanted something from him, and no one seemed to see the person beneath the crown. Cassian shared memories of his childhood, the parents who died when he was young, the years spent in service learning to make himself invisible, the countless small cruelties that had taught him people in power rarely cared about those beneath them. They compared scars, both literal and metaphorical, and found healing in being truly known by another person. By the time dawn light filtered through the windows, they had decided to formalize their bond, but to do it strategically, building more support for Omega rights first, so that when they announced their matehood, it would be seen as the culmination of reform rather than its beginning. Drop a comment below about how you think the kingdom will react to their bond, and share this video with anyone who loves romance stories about challenging unjust systems. The next 2 years were a whirlwind of reform, resistance, and gradual transformation. Cassian and Theron worked tirelessly to reshape the kingdom's laws and culture, often facing setbacks and opposition, but never giving up. They established schools that educated all designations equally, created legal protections that made it criminal to abuse Omegas, reformed the tax system to be more equitable, and began redistributing unclaimed lands to families who would actually farm them rather than letting them sit fallow in noble portfolios. Each change was fought by traditional factions who saw their privilege eroding, but Theron proved willing to use force when necessary, and Cassian's growing popularity among common people provided political cover for controversial decisions. The young nobles, seeing which way power was shifting, began cautiously supporting reform, calculating that aligning with the king's vision was smarter than clinging to a dying system. Damien and Seraphina, watching their world crumble while the Omega they had tormented rose ever higher, finally made their move. They had spent years building a coalition of displaced nobles, traditionalist alphas, and anyone else bitter about losing privilege under the new regime. The conspiracy they orchestrated was sophisticated, planning to assassinate both Theron and Cassian during the annual Harvest Festival, when security would be complicated by large crowds and multiple events happening simultaneously. They recruited palace guards who felt overlooked for promotion, bribed servants to provide access to restricted areas, and purchased weapons enchanted to bypass magical protections. It should have worked, would have worked, except that one of the conspirators, a young beta who had been coerced into participation, developed a conscience at the last moment and warned palace security about the plot. The warning came just hours before the assassination attempt was scheduled, giving Theron barely enough time to organize a response. Rather than canceling the festival and alerting the conspirators that their plan had been discovered, he decided to let events unfold while having loyal guards in position to intercept the attack. It was risky, potentially deadly, but Theron argued that simply arresting the conspirators without proof of actual attempt wouldn't send the message needed to deter future plots. Cassian was terrified, but agreed to the plan, trusting Theron's tactical judgment, even as his mate Bond screamed warnings of danger. They attended the festival as planned, smiling and waving to crowds, while hyper-aware of every person who came too close, every shadow that might hide a threat. The attack came during the ceremonial lighting of the harvest bonfire, when Theron and Cassian stood together on the raised platform with their backs to the crowd. 3 guards who had been bribed rushed forward with enchanted blades, moving faster than normal humans could, aiming for vital points that would kill instantly. But Theron had positioned his most trusted warriors in key locations, and they intercepted the traitors before weapons could find their marks. The fight was brief, but brutal. 1 attacker was subdued, 2 were killed when they refused to surrender, and the crowd erupted into chaos as people realized their king had nearly been murdered before their eyes. Theron immediately took control, his voice magically amplified to reach everyone present. This attack was orchestrated by individuals who cannot accept that our kingdom is changing, that privilege based solely on birth is ending, that Omegas are people deserving of respect and protection. But as you can see, they have failed, and they will continue to fail, because the future belongs to those brave enough to build it, not to those desperately clinging to an unjust past. The surviving attacker, faced with execution or cooperation, revealed the entire conspiracy, including Damien and Seraphina's central roles. Theron's response was swift and merciless. He arrested everyone involved, held public trials that provided overwhelming evidence of treason, and executed the ringleaders while exiling lesser participants. Damien and Seraphina, finally facing consequences they couldn't talk or manipulate their way out of, showed their true cowardice. Damien begged for mercy and tried to blame Seraphina for everything, while Seraphina attempted to seduce her way to leniency right up until the moment the executioner's blade fell. Their deaths were not celebrated by Cassian or Theron, who took no pleasure in killing even those who had tried to kill them. But they were necessary to establish that attempts to restore the old oppressive order would not be tolerated. In the aftermath of the conspiracy, public sentiment shifted dramatically. Common people, realizing how close they had come to losing a king who actually cared about their welfare, rallied behind Theron's reforms with newfound enthusiasm. Even conservative nobles, seeing that violent resistance led only to death or exile, began accepting changes they had previously fought. Cassian's role in the new order became undeniable. He had proven his competence repeatedly, survived assassination attempts with grace, and demonstrated leadership that earned respect, even from those predisposed to hate him. 3 years after he had knelt in a puddle of wine while nobles laughed, Cassian stood before the assembled court as Theron formally acknowledged their mate bond and announced his intention to make Cassian his king consort, giving him authority second only to Theron himself. The ceremony was magnificent, blending traditional elements with innovations that reflected the kingdom's changing values. Cassian wore robes of deep purple embroidered with silver, colors that symbolized both Omega designation and royal authority, claiming space that had been denied to people like him for centuries. Theron spoke vows that promised partnership rather than domination, mutual support rather than hierarchy, and the crowd that had once mocked an Omega servant now cheered for their king consort with genuine enthusiasm. It wasn't universal acceptance. There were still nobles who sneered and commoners who clung to old prejudices, but it was progress, undeniable and irreversible progress toward a more just society. As Theron placed the consort's crown on Cassian's head, a circlet of intertwined silver and gold representing their joined lives, Cassian thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, and felt overwhelming gratitude not just for Theron, but for his own resilience, the strength that had kept him whole through years of abuse and allowed him to seize opportunity when it finally came. In the years that followed, Cassian and Theron continued reshaping their kingdom, their partnership proving more effective than either could have been. Alone, Cassian's experiences gave him insight into problems Theron had never faced, while Theron's position gave them power to implement solutions Cassian could only have dreamed of as a servant. They established healing centers for Omegas escaping abuse, funded by estates seized from nobles convicted of cruelty. They created apprenticeship programs that taught valuable skills to people regardless of designation, opening paths to prosperity that had previously been closed. They reformed the justice system to apply laws equally to all people, rather than giving preferential treatment to alphas. Not every initiative succeeded. They faced resistance, made mistakes, and sometimes had to compromise more than they wanted. But the overall trajectory was clear: movement toward equity and dignity for everyone rather than privilege for a select few. Cassian never forgot where he came from, even as he grew comfortable in his role as king consort. He regularly visited the servant quarters, speaking with people who lived as he once had, and listening to their concerns. He used his position to advocate for better working conditions, fair wages, and protections against arbitrary punishment. Some nobles complained that he was too sympathetic to the lower classes, that he couldn't be objective because of his background. But Cassian rejected the premise that objectivity meant ignoring suffering. His bias was toward justice and human dignity, and he made no apologies for that. Theron supported him completely, often pointing out that Cassian's supposed bias produced better outcomes than the supposed objectivity of nobles who had never experienced hardship. Their love deepened over time, moving beyond the initial intensity of new matehood into something more complex and enduring. They learned each other's rhythms, discovered how to support each other through difficult decisions, and found joy in simple moments stolen between royal responsibilities. They built a life together that balanced public duty with private happiness. And if some nights Cassian still woke from nightmares of being back in that great hall with wine dripping down his face, Theron was always there to hold him and remind him that he was safe, valued, and loved. The mate bond between them grew stronger, allowing them to sense each other's emotions even when apart, and providing comfort that neither had expected to find. They were partners in the truest sense, each making the other better and stronger than they could have been alone. On the 5th anniversary of Cassian's elevation to nobility, they hosted a celebration that brought together people from all levels of society, servants and nobles mixing in ways that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. Cassian stood on a balcony overlooking the festivities, Theron's arm around his waist, and reflected on how far they had come. The kingdom wasn't perfect. Prejudice still existed and inequities remained, but the trajectory had fundamentally changed. Omegas no longer lived in constant fear of arbitrary abuse. Common people had paths to advancement, and leaders were expected to serve rather than simply rule. It was the beginning of something better, and Cassian knew that the work would continue long after he and Theron were gone, that the systems they had built would need constant maintenance and protection against those who would try to restore old injustices. But tonight, looking out at people of all designations, laughing and celebrating together, Cassian allowed himself to feel proud of what they had accomplished. He thought about the titles that had been stripped from cruel nobles and given to someone they had mocked, and realized that those titles had become more than symbols of status. They had become tools for transformation, leverage to dismantle the very systems that had once given them meaning. Theron had taken weapons used for oppression and turned them into instruments of liberation, and Cassian had proven worthy of that trust by using his position to lift others rather than simply elevating himself. It was a different kind of power than what Damien and Seraphina had wielded, but it was infinitely more meaningful because it was built on justice rather than domination. Make sure to subscribe if you want more stories about challenging oppressive systems and building something better from their ruins. As the celebration continued below, Theron turned to Cassian with a smile. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Taking the risk, accepting my offer, enduring everything that came after? Would you choose differently if you could go back to that night?" Cassian didn't hesitate. "Not for a moment," he said. "Every hardship, every attack, every sleepless night worrying about failing or making mistakes that would hurt people, all of it was worth it. Because we've genuinely made things better. We've proven that change is possible even in systems designed to resist it. That courage and persistence can overcome entrenched power. And that love can be a revolutionary force when channeled toward justice. I wouldn't trade this life for anything. Not safety. Not peace. Not even the innocence I lost along the way. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. With you. Doing this work. Building this future." Theron kissed him softly, a gesture of affection and affirmation. "Then we'll keep building," he said. "We'll keep fighting for every person who suffers under unjust systems, and we'll teach the next generation to continue this work when we're gone. Together, Cassian, There's nothing we can't accomplish. Cassian leaned into the embrace, feeling the truth of those words resonate through their mate bond. They had come so far from that night in the Great Hall, when he had knelt in wine while nobles laughed, and they would go further still. The titles that had been stripped and redistributed were just the beginning, symbols of a deeper transformation that would reshape their entire society. And Cassian, the Omega, who had once been told he was worthless, would spend the rest of his life proving that everyone deserved dignity, respect, and the chance to rise as high as their courage and compassion could take them. Years later, when historians wrote about this period, they would call it the Great Reform, the era when a visionary king and his Omega consort dismantled centuries of oppression and built something better from the ruins. They would study the policies implemented, debate the tactics used, and argue about whether change could have come more quickly or with less conflict. But they would universally agree that the partnership between Theron and Cassian had been transformative, that two people who should never have met, according to the old social order, had found each other and used their connection to heal a broken kingdom, and in the villages and towns where Omegas no longer lived in fear, in the schools where all children learned together. Regardless of designation, in the courts where laws applied equally to everyone, Cassian's legacy lived on not as a title or position, but as proof that no one is defined by the circumstances of their birth, and that the most powerful force in the world is not domination, but the courage to imagine and fight for something better. The moon rose over the palace, casting silver light across gardens where people celebrated a future built on justice rather than privilege, and Cassian stood with his mate and thought about all the Omegas who would never have to kneel in wine, would never have to make themselves small and invisible, would never have to wonder if they were truly human in the eyes of those who held power over them. That was the real victory. Not titles or positions, or even the love he had found with Theron, but the knowledge that they had broken chains that had bound countless people for generations and created space for everyone to live with dignity. It was worth everything. They had endured and everything they had sacrificed, and Cassian knew that if he had 1,000 lifetimes, he would choose this path every single time, because some things are more important than personal happiness or safety, and justice is one of them. The Alpha King had stripped titles from those who abused power and given them to someone they had mocked, and in doing so, he had started a revolution that would echo through generations. This is their story, a testament to courage, love, and the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to accept oppression as inevitable or unchangeable.